Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. And today we're coming back after a short break, but it's been an eventful couple of months in South Asia, and the world for that matter. And before we move on to our main story for today, I have to take note of the incredible story playing out in Bangladesh right now, as a student-led protest movement has ousted the 15-year government of Sheikh Hasina, who has fled the country seeking exile. Regular listeners will remember that we covered the extremely flawed Bangladesh election back in January, where we discussed the rampant electoral malpractices, the use of paramilitary forces, and other steps Sheikh Hasina's Awami League took to secure her victory. Well, it looks like the chickens have finally come home to roost when a protest about job reservations escalated into a nationwide revolution that has now ousted her government, driven her to exile, and installed Mohammed Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner, as a chief advisor to an army-backed interim government. Look, it's a complicated and evolving situation at the moment, and we'll be dedicating our next episode to the subject. But our topic for today takes us to the western edge of South Asia, across the Hindu Kush Mountains, where the Taliban regime is coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the group's takeover of Afghanistan in 2021. The ascendance of the Taliban 2.0 regime after a 20-year spell of opposition as the US kicked them out of government in 2001 has led to substantial changes in Afghan society and had raised wider concerns about the reemergence of terrorism and instability that were prevalent during the Taliban's first spell of power in the 1990s. But what is the outlook for the Taliban regime 2 years after it took power? How is it performed essentially as a regime, as a government, let's say? What impact has it had on the people of Afghanistan? And what role might it play in the evolving and changing geopolitical situation in Asia? Our guest today will help answer some of those questions and many more, providing a micro and macro level look at the Taliban regime after 2 years, from the trials and travails endured by the Afghan people to the wider geopolitical impact of its domestic and foreign policy. Stay tuned. So today we're joined by Zara Joya. Zara is an Afghan journalist living in London and the editor-in-chief and founder of Rukhsana Media, a news agency reporting on life for women and girls in Afghanistan. Born in Afghanistan in 1992, she saw the Taliban take over her country at the age of 5 and had to disguise herself as a boy just to be able to attend school until the US overthrow of the Taliban in 2001. After a stint as a deputy director of communications for the Kabul government, where she was one of the few or the only woman in her department, she founded Rukhsana Media in 2020 as the country's first feminist news outlet. Today, she is based in London, having had fled the Taliban takeover in 2021, but continues to stay in touch with her brave journalists on the ground in Afghanistan and shed light on the plight of those who've had the most to lose from the Taliban regime and the least amount of voice to opposition. Zara was named one of Time's Women of the Year in 2022 and received the 2022 Changemaker Award from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, amongst many, many other awards. Zara, thank you so much for joining the podcast and welcome to Beyond the Indus.
Thank you for having me, and hello to everyone listening to this podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So just to start off with, I want to give our guests a reminder of who the Taliban are, because today we're going to be talking about what their regime is like 3 years after they've taken over in 2021. But to harken back to the days of Taliban 1.0, as they call it, you've lived through that previous iteration. Could you maybe give us a sense and remind listeners of what indignities and brutalities the Taliban had inflicted on the women and girls of Afghanistan the last time they were fully in power?
Well, this is a very good question, actually. We have to at least recognize first the problem and also to give them name. And then after that, we can honestly find a solution for that. Well, the Taliban are a violent group. They have a very core ideology and the concept of Islamic Sharia law, which is unfortunately it's a tool that the Taliban are using against the people and and as using as a tool to stay in power. So they do not value equal rights for people at all. They expect people to be their slaves. They have only found an opportunity in Afghanistan But if they could, they would do this all over the world. They control people with weapons and violence. Freedom is a beautiful and meaningful word, but unfortunately, the Taliban are against this freedom word, which is really disappointing for Afghans, for myself, for the others that they are living in, in the different conditions. Imagine when people are free, they have the ability to create change. For example, when women and girls in Afghanistan were given a little freedom and opportunity after the Taliban, the first regime, they started to make changes. They began by changing themselves first. During the Taliban rules from 1996 to 2001, women and girls in Afghanistan faced severe restrictions and brutalities. Women were banned from working outside the home, attending a school, and even living their homes without a male relative. So, at that time, women were required to wear the burqa, which is covered them from head to toe. So, this is the definition of the Taliban as a group. So, by the way, the Taliban are depend on one ethnicity group, which is called Pashtun. And unfortunately, this group is receiving lots of support from those people who belong to this ideology, who believes in discrimination, who believes in inequality. So this is the definition of the Taliban to power. So if I got your second question was about my sense, right?
Your reaction and that of the women of Afghanistan when, the Taliban fell. Yeah.
So first, as you mentioned earlier, honestly, I can say the Taliban as a group who wants to stay in power, who wants to gain a power for the others, and who wants to play as a politics issue with the human rights. So for me, in the first role of the Taliban, they took in my childhood. And as a girl, I wasn't able to stay and to live what I want, what I wish, but there was no childhood for me as a girl. So I had the chance and the support of my family to change my whole identity, which is sometimes it's so difficult to explain, And after the first Taliban fall, my reaction and that of many Afghans when the Taliban were in 2001, they overthrown in 2001, was one of immense relief and hope for a brighter future. I often have mixed feelings when I look back at the first role of the Taliban in Afghanistan and then see the little opportunities of the last 20 years for women and girls in Afghanistan.
There's a point of criticism or a challenge, but there's this famous photo of Afghanistan in the 1970s before the Soviet invasion, where they show pictures of, girls in universities walking in Western clothes and with the hijab or burqa and stuff. And many people sort of show that as, hey, this is what Afghanistan used to be. But the critique of that might be that even though Afghan women have seen substantial progress after the Taliban fell, some allege that this was limited to the cities. Mostly urban women with better opportunities, had access to this freedom. And a lot of rural Afghan women in the villages didn't experience it. You lived there. You worked in both government and non-governmental roles. What was your sense of the progress that women made, not just in the cities, but also in the rural areas?
So personally, I have the experience living in village, in city. which is, I think I have this privilege to have this kind of experience. Living in a village and living in a city is totally different experience. But I think societies like Afghanistan, which are very complex, I think. Afghanistan is a multicultural country. Dozens of ethnicity groups are living in that country. And I believe when we are facing with this kind of societies like Afghanistan, we definitely need a long time for change, right? One thing is very clear. So people with knowledge and education can always change their lives and their living environment. But unfortunately, ideology and brainwashing are never easily to change, So for people in Afghanistan, who are individuals who are not belong to any kind of ideology that the Taliban have, they changed a lot. I can say a lot, and during this short time in Afghanistan, even in village in the remote areas, we have seen lots of changes. For example, in Badakhshan, in North Afghanistan, which is very far from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. There is a very famous photo that one old man, he helped two younger daughter of his daughter to help, them to go to school. Unfortunately, in remote areas, people don't have access to the facilities, to public services. It is very limited. So in Badakhshan, that man was cycling 1 hour or 2 hours to carry his daughters to school and coming back with them to home. Let's be honest. It's a very enthusiastic of behavior of some kind of men, because then that man or that father from Badakhshan was an individual person. He believes on what he has, what he is living. He believes on his way and his principle. But the other hand, we have Taliban. We have seen many schools have been burned by the Taliban, have been shut down by the Taliban. And the recent explosion. A huge explosion happened in one girls' school in West Kabul in Hazara community. The Taliban tried to first they tried to convince people, and especially the men of Afghanistan, to put restriction on women and girls. And the other side, when they couldn't do that, the people said no to the Taliban ideology and to the Taliban order. And after the Taliban started to close the schools and the university by violence, we have seen many violations, many explosion and bombing happened in university and in schools and educational centers. So when I'm seeing, often I have mixed feelings when I look back the first Taliban, the Taliban roles now, and the people life of after 2001 until 2021.
But I want to ask you, because when the Taliban first came to power in 2021, I'd interviewed a student living here who was from Badakhshan, in fact, actually. And he was saying that the Taliban hasn't changed. I guess back in the day, if you remember, people were like, oh, is this Taliban going to be different? It's Taliban 2.0. But all the Afghans who lived outside Afghanistan were like, do not be fooled by them. They make their promises and they will break them. Just give them time. And that seems to have happened. But I guess what's difficult to understand is an entire generation, 20 years, they were raised in relative freedom, right? They had access to education to a large degree. They had some degree of international media access. How does this generation take this lying down? I'm sure they don't like that. So could you maybe elaborate on, over the past 3 years, what restrictions have the new Taliban, so to speak, even though they're not new, what have they imposed on women and girls in particular and in society in general? And how are ordinary Afghans fighting back?
Well, so I think a very simple example that shows how the people of Afghanistan hate the Taliban, how the people of Afghanistan are against the Taliban ideology. That shows that, millions of Afghans left their country. They just they accepted the whole danger. They went to Pakistan, Iran, the neighbors country, and all countries, and also they taking a high risk to at least flee from the horrors and this horrible situation in Afghanistan. So, as you know, Afghanistan is a big country. It has almost 40 million population. So obviously, it's not possible for the whole entire population to leave their country. It's not, unfortunately, it's not. The world doesn't have this capacity to accept them. When we see many families, they just flee Afghanistan because they thought we need to give them, our children, a second chance to learn, to get education, to improve their life, the way of knowledge. But on the other hand, as you see, Afghanistan is not safe right now. There is lots of other activities. In terroristic activities are going on. And many terrorist groups are active in the country, and people are suffering from poverty. 98% of the population of Afghanistan are living under line of poverty, and also the half of the population of Afghanistan banned from public life. They are in prison of their homes. So we can see how it is difficult for Afghan people to see who are ruling our country, right? Because even we have seen lots of news and other what it says. Sorry, 1 minute. Just forgot to that. So proofs that we have seen lots of news and proofs, which just shows that even the Taliban, they are not in one direction. They have lots of problems between them. So, but anyway, we do not want to include the Taliban with the other civil societies and women and the other ethnicity groups, because what we are seeing in Afghanistan is totally a different kind of views. Lots of restrictions going on by the Taliban on people's life. On the other hand, we have lots of people that they are risking themselves, but they don't want to give up, and they want to at least struggle and fight with the core ideology. For example, at the moment, you can see across the country, across Afghanistan, hundreds of secret schools, which is a very simple example that the Taliban banned public schools, public services to women, but the society, the people and citizens, they don't want to give up. They said, okay, you banned that way, so we will open one another way. So obviously, as I mentioned, the core ideology will not change. But unfortunately, the Taliban have a very core ideology. They are a group of people that they make a commitment of staying on their ideology. So this is a problem. We never have seen any single change on the Taliban behavior. It's the same, when the Taliban took power in the first time, so they banned school, they banned girls from education, they banned women from work. Only the women on that time, even in 2 decades ago, the women, they had the chance to work as a doctor, as a female doctor, in the hospital. But at the moment, it's the same. Only nurses and midwives and doctors are able to work at the public services, but not the others. And also, I have the same experience. In 2019, I think there was a negotiation conference between Afghans and the Taliban representative in Moscow, where I was the first female journalist of Afghanistan, had the chance to do an interview with one of the Taliban senior members, Mullah Abdul Salam Hanafi. When I was asked him about the girls' education, I told him, so you will come back to Afghanistan to share the power with others. So what is your point of view about the girls' education? This is a big concern, And then he told me, yeah, when we go back, when we will be back in Afghanistan, we definitely will allow the girls to go to school, which is very big lie, And I was watching and seeing his eyes, and it was a lie. So we couldn't. We never see any single changes in the Taliban behavior. But this time, however, by the technology, by the improvement of Afghan government, the Taliban, they are in a better position, honestly, because during this 20 years, the Taliban had an office in Doha, a political office. So they had the chance to training, a group of people who can, in terms of politics, in terms of, the communication skills. They can, right now they are doing very, that kind of group of the Taliban are doing very, powerful things. They are lobbying for the Taliban. They know multiple languages, especially English. They can easily communicate with Western countries, and they can convince the politics of the other countries who still have some interest in Afghanistan issue. So this is the kind of thing. So basically, we have to divide the Taliban in different groups. For example, we have one Taliban that he called the Taliban leader, Mullah Hibatullah. He is in a higher position, and he says, I am the holy person, which is of course it's a lie. And he is looks monster figure of the Taliban. And the second level are the Taliban politics figures that they have this ability to to communicate with the other countries, to lobby for themselves. And the third group of the Taliban, who are carrying guns and weapons and doing violence and doing some and whipping the people in public, and also they are so brutal. They are rolling in the prisons, jails. So recently in Roshana Media and with the Guardian, we have published a story of a gun rape video of an activist or women activist in the jail. So this is really, really disappointing for me as a journalist and as a citizen of Afghanistan.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's interesting because you're saying that they basically enlisted this sort of suave, media savvy, layer of people to promote their interests in Western media, while they still retain that brutal sort of foot soldier, which, imposes their will. I don't know if you remember this, but I think this was in 2020 when the New York Times, on its opinion page, had an entire page dedicated to the spokesperson of the Taliban who gave his opinion. And I was shocked because this is the same New York Times that refused to publish Republican and right-leaning politicians in America because they thought they were a threat to democracy. But they gave an entire page to the Taliban, and I couldn't believe my eyes. But to address that, you founded Rukshana Media as sort of a focused feminist outlet, which is always interesting in a country like Afghanistan, and it still continues to do incredible journalism in a very risky environment. My question is, how does media currently operate in Afghanistan? How are they regulated, and how does the Taliban make sure journalists stay in line? And maybe you could just highlight what your journalists and others have been doing in Afghanistan, how they do their jobs, and what risks they have to endure.
Well, I would like to raise one point that you mentioned before I give an answer to your question. Honestly, we cannot ignore the role of the international media to how they're gonna give them chance and platforms to the Taliban. This is really, really disappointed for me. We had meeting with the team of Washington Post in DC, and the reaction of the editorial team and what they giving answer to our request was really disappointing for me. So that's true. Taliban are ruling Afghanistan. They have gun. They have power. Honestly, they don't have power because they, it is very obvious that the people inside of the country are against the Taliban, and the Taliban doesn't have roots in the society. So I'm sure the Taliban government will fall down hopefully soon. If not soon, it will. But when I'm seeing that the international media, some of them actually, not all of them, some of them, giving them a lot of opportunities and a lot of platform to the Taliban, and this was really, still it's a question. For example, at the moment, the women of Afghanistan, they shown that the real resilience. They took in street, they did protest, and they went to jail, and they have been arrested by the Taliban, and they have been violent, they have been beaten by the Taliban. And we're gonna see that the specific media outlets like you said, New York Times, they're not gonna publish a single word about this kind of resilience. So this is really difficult for us to accept it. So back to your question. Operating a media outlet like Rukshana Media in Afghanistan under the Taliban is incredibly challenging. So that is why I am in exile. I am living in exile. Rukshana Media is running from exile, and I left everything behind, including my parents, which is one of the risks that was on me, and I couldn't accept that risk, and I couldn't say that I couldn't stay in the country because it was not possible, honestly. So during these 23 years, the journalists face countless threats, censorships and harassment. The Taliban monitor and really, and rolling media closely, punishing those who do not accept the Taliban policy and guidelines. And with we have seen that during these 3 years, more than hundreds of Afghan journalists have been arrested, beatings, and even killed. And have been killed. So despite this risk, still, journalists, I think they are a brave force in Afghanistan, alongside of Afghan women and the others who are against the Taliban, who are the opposite of the Taliban. So they continue to report, they, highlighting the ongoing struggles and resilience of Afghan people. And this is, I think, one of the way that we can keep awareness about Afghanistan issues, about Afghanistan itself. And also, so many people, unfortunately, the whole population of Afghanistan, they cannot criticize the Taliban, because if they do, I'm sure they're gonna be killed, they gonna be arrested, and they're gonna be maybe tortured. So for me, working in Roshana Media is not only a simple work of journalistic work. It's another simple journalistic work. It's something like kind of resilience, kind of a sign that shows that we gonna not give up, because this is important for us to keep our voice and the people's voices raised, and this is really something for us to amplify those who are silent by now, who have been told to be silent.
As we talk about the role of international media and organizations, a few weeks ago, the Cricket World Cup just ended. And as an Indian, I was obviously watching that. And there was a moment there when Afghanistan, the men's cricket team of Afghanistan, advanced to semi-finals. It was inspiring. And, just watching Rashid Khan talking on the phone to a Taliban minister, that kind of ruined that moment for me. As happy as I am for the Afghanistan men's cricket team, the women's cricket team has been living in exile, because by law, you have to, if you want to be part of the national cricket government, you have to have a men's and women's team. This is non-negotiable, except an exception for Afghanistan. I find that very profoundly disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
You have described the situation in Afghanistan as a gender apartheid. And I guess if this is an apartheid, then we should, the idea is we should react to it the way we do to other apartheid regimes, by cutting off international recognition, stopping their sports teams or stopping their trade, and not recognizing the government. And some people say that this is how we can force the Taliban to improve conditions for girls, while other organizations sort of inch cautiously towards recognition, saying that, hey, only if we can talk to them can we pressure them to make progress. What is your view on this conundrum? Which do you think, isolation or engagement, is a better strategy to secure better conditions for Afghan girls?
No one, honestly, no one wants an isolation for or sanction for her country or his country. For me, it's the same. I don't want isolation for my country. Afghanistan is a beautiful country. It has a important geopolitical strategic position in the Middle East, and also it's a beautiful country. We cannot, for me, it's really difficult to say I want isolation on Afghanistan and to be divide from part of the world. But the problem is not that kind of, the problem is in Afghanistan, we have almost 14 million population. We have different kind of political groups. We have educated people. We have many others, politicians, activists. So the problem is that we want from our international community to do not, engage with the Taliban. So the Taliban are looking and seeking for international legitimacy. They are saying that we want to be, a partner, activist partner for international community. So, international community and the countries, for example, like the US, like the UK, like India, they have their definition of foreign policy. They have a foreign policy. They have norms. So we have global norms already. So when the Taliban, they do not fix with that kind of policies. That kind of principle. So this is not our problem. It is our problem actually, that we just asking the people that if a group from Afghanistan want to join the international community, wants to be on the table with you, and wants to be engaged with the whole entire world. So just ask them, where is the principle of their role? What is their role in terms of political, political activities, in terms of ruling the country, in terms of global human rights law, in terms of other issues that's really related to accept as a partner in the globe. So we don't have this kind of question from the international community. This is really disappointing for us, So Afghanistan has so much democratic groups. So why the international community wants to have engagement with the Taliban? Why they don't prefer to stay behind the other groups that they believe in human rights, they believe in gender equality, they believe in progress, they believe in freedom of speech. So this is the kind of elements or the kind of tools that we should first prioritize for our engagement. So you mentioned about that famous figure of cricket team of Afghanistan, Rashid Khan. So, for me, when it was a joyful moment when the team won and that cricket play. So, but the rest of the day, when the end of the day, that man called to the Taliban foreign minister, the de facto foreign minister of the Taliban, and said, congratulations. For what? For me as a woman, as a girl, that I am listening to the woman, I am listening to the girls who are in prison of the house. It was it was really harmful, and it was, and that action was so, it's totally heartbroken for all Afghan women.
Yeah, it was difficult as well, because it was obviously a media opportunity for the minister, who was piggybacking on the success of the team. I'm pretty sure they discouraged playing sports in Afghanistan. They seem to have banned everything else. They seem to have banned music, so it's very sad to see that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess coming towards the end of the interview, like I said, I was in Berlin during the Iran protests. What was interesting to see was that the diaspora played an important role in raising awareness during that. They organized marches, demonstrations. I guess the question is, both for the Afghan diaspora, who might feel, helpless sometimes looking at the situation back home, and foreigners, people like me, people who care about the situation in Afghanistan, who want a progressive and prosperous Afghanistan, but maybe don't know what they can do in their own personal capacity. What do you think that the ordinary person can do in their personal capacity to support the women, the girls, the oppressed minorities in Afghanistan? What action can the ordinary man or woman take?
I think this is a very good question. I believe the Afghan diaspora and non-Afghans who believes in the freedom of speech, freedom of women and movement, and freedom of human rights, they can support Afghan and women and girls in several ways. So raising awareness through social media, protest, and public speaking can keep global attention on Afghanistan. So supporting NGOs and charities that provide education, healthcare, and legal assistance to Afghan women is really crucial. So advocacy for refugee policies that especially when women and girls in Afghanistan they're fleeing from the persecution or who are in a very high risk. So this is another issues that they can help and they can support the people of Afghanistan. And another issues, we have Afghans who are active, who are doing lots of activities to keep the Afghan issues on and keep the people and the international community informed what is going on in Afghanistan. For example, in Rukhsana Media, so myself, my colleagues around the world, we have colleagues in different countries, so we are stay on and we have this connection with Afghanistan. We just want to do reports, and giving them a platform for Afghans and to us this talk and speak, because this is kind of thing that we can do. For example, Afghan diaspora has a very good capacity in the different countries. So I think they can do the same things. They can advocacy, they can raising awareness, and they can even protest and asking for international community to put the Taliban accountable, because right now the Taliban are receiving lots of money every week. So we need from international allies to give at least to ask the Taliban, give them a list of where this international aid's going, who is the beneficiary of this international community, this international aid. So who in which area the Taliban are giving the people a chance to use this international aid. So this is the kind of, we have lots of issues that the international community, including NGOs, charities, and Afghan diaspora can do for Afghanistan.
Right. And I think one of the most important things as well is to not take your eye off the ball, to keep on following news in Afghanistan, to not forget about the women and girls of Afghanistan, So I think for our audience, if you want to learn more, you can obviously follow Zara's outlet, Rukhsana Media. So yeah, with that, Zara, thank you so much for joining the podcast and sharing your views, and good luck to the struggle ahead of you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So joining us today is Dr. Shanti Mariette D'Souza. Dr. D'Souza is a distinguished expert on Afghanistan and South Asian security policy and was the Fulbright Nehru Visiting Chair in Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's currently the founder and executive director of Mantraya, a think tank focused on strategic studies and analysis. Dr. D'Souza's extensive experience includes roles as a visiting faculty member at the Naval War College in Goa, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., as well as advisory and fellowship positions in a number of strategic and policy think tanks around the world. And what's particularly interesting for me is that Dr. D'Souza's expertise on Afghanistan is built on years of field research and advisory positions, including work with the Independent Directorate of Local Governance in Afghanistan and as an international election observer for the 2014 Afghan presidential elections. So she actually has on-ground experience dealing with Afghanistan and Afghan politics. So I think she's an excellent guest to have to talk about this side of the Afghanistan issue. So with that, Professor D'Souza, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I think it's important that you're talking about Afghanistan at a time when everyone seems to have forgotten that country. And I think it's a timely discussion that we are going to have. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great. I'm quite keen to speak to you about Afghanistan because I suspect a lot of the narratives that we hear coming out of Afghanistan, at least even for people who follow the country over the past 2 years, tend to gravitate more towards A, the human rights situation, or B, the foreign policy problems they have with their neighbors, or terrorism for that matter, and ISIS-K. But very rarely do we see analyses on the evaluation of the Taliban as a government ruling a state. So I'd like to ask you, what is your evaluation of the Taliban's government over the past 3 years? And what sort of political and economic challenges have they faced since the takeover of Kabul in 2021? And how are they dealing with those challenges?
Well, I think it's interesting that you use the term narratives coming from Afghanistan because that's precisely the scenario now. So the two different and contrasting narratives from Afghanistan. One depicts of Taliban as a group which is in control and able to deliver security, justice, and even doing very well on the economic factor. For instance, if you look at the data which is coming from Afghanistan on one side, which says that the Taliban have been able to increase their tax collection rates, particularly at the borders, which has generated revenue for the country. That is seen as a plus side. So to be fair to assessing what the Taliban really means and how are they doing on the ground, I think we need to look at areas and problems in which they are situated at this moment. When they captured power on August 15, 2021, it was not a legal group and it's still not a legal group. So I would refrain from using the word Taliban government, but would use regime because that's what they are. They are a illegal group and they don't have the legitimacy, not just from the international community, but also within Afghanistan. So having said that, if I have to evaluate or we have to evaluate what the Taliban has really done is, in terms of security, there seems to be lessening in terms of the violence, which was instructive in terms of what happened in the last 2 decades in Afghanistan. There were increasing levels of violence and fighting with groups. That has kind of come down. But that, again, I would say with a caveat because there are other groups like ISK and also Al-Qaeda, which is functioning in that country, which I'll talk to you in detail a little bit later. But on the whole, if you look at what they do on the ground, I would say a positive would be in terms of their tax collections, in terms of generating their own economic revenues through mining and small, medium enterprises. But on the negative, and that's the other narrative, and which I think depicts more of the reality Afghanistan is in today. If you look at the reports which are coming from the UN, particularly from the UNDP, the Afghan economy is contracted by 27%, leading to economic stagnation in that country. And what is more important and what needs to be taken note of is that the restrictions on women's rights are alone estimated to have caused an economic loss between 600 million and $1 billion US. In addition to that, you also have escalating rates of unemployment, which is almost at 35% now. And our average Afghan hardly earns anything in terms of their income. So if you look at the data which is coming from that country, it looks very, very abysmal in terms of the performance of that regime itself. In 2024, an estimated 23.7 million people required humanitarian assistance. Yet, as on 15 May, the Afghanistan Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan for 2024 has received only 16.2%. So there's not much money coming into the country as well. So this is not a great figure. Now you look at the social indicators. If you look at the Global Hunger Index of 2023, Afghanistan ranks 114 out of 125 countries. So there is a very high level of hunger in addition to unemployment. And approximately 85% of Afghans live on less than $1 a day. So this is a situation where there is a little bit of positive development on one side, but that doesn't mean it has transformed life for the Afghans on the economic side. So there is a severe crisis. And if you look at even the fact that they banned the drug cultivation, that has also impacted the farmers and the livelihoods of people who live on the margins. Now look at the other sector. When you look at the political sector, there are huge problems in terms of not including other groups and other ethnic composition in terms of the governance or in terms of even the political inclusion. Justice, again, itself is questionable because at one level, it looks like they deliver instant justice. And this was a very romantic image of the Taliban, which was perpetuated from Taliban 1 is that they deliver instant justice, which is something people in the in the rural areas where the courts were hardly able to make any difference, were in sync with what the Taliban were doing. But today, if you look at it, they are targeting political opposition. They target women. They impose the strict interpretation of the Islamic laws. Women are beaten up. Men are beaten up by the Department of Vice and Virtue. So it's not a very rosy scenario in terms of the justice or the rule of law. Then you come down to look at what they did in terms of the drug trade. So they banned the opium poppy cultivation and production in Afghanistan in April 2020, 8 months after they had captured power. So as you know, Afghanistan supplies more than 80% of the global illegal opiate demand and trade. And it has been a serious slowdown. So it is seen as a positive side. But look on the other way of what is really occurring. The opium stockpiles in Afghanistan are so great that there's no real difference on the ground. Trade continues. The Taliban and the Haqqani network seem to be benefiting from it. And the numerous de facto authority figures who are using it. For instance, if you look at reports from the ground, the Taliban governor of Nangarhar province, that is Mohammad Naim Barish Kudai, he controls the eastern road, and the governor of Balkh province, that is in the northern province in Afghanistan, Yusuf Wafa, controls the northern road. So they are, benefiting. So you do see two narratives. One, they have announced that they have banned drugs and they want international assistance. So they have destroyed 834 laboratories and eradicated crops in 14,000 hectares area. But what does it really mean? It means that the lab still exists, the stockpile still exists, and the trade continues. And that trade is finding ways from various routes from the northern and eastern. From the eastern, it comes to India. From the northern, it goes to Europe and elsewhere. So this is the broad picture I would like to bring in front of you when you ask me for an evaluation of the regime in the last 3 years. So they have been able to generate certain amount of income, but they're not been able to stabilize the economy or provide opportunities for employment, for alternate livelihoods to the farmer. And therefore, there is a severe economic crisis in that country. And that itself has the potential to add to instability in the country and then spill over outside. And you're seeing that in various forms.
Right. And that's an interesting point that even after 2 years of the eradication campaigns, you're saying the stockpiles is still so sufficient that it's barely made a dent to the ground. You know, it's interesting getting this inside point of view from Afghanistan, because I was telling you before, we just spoke to Zara Joya, and many Afghan exiles and activists I speak to from abroad, in Germany, for instance, repeatedly insist, and I think correctly insist in some aspects, that there's no difference, in the Taliban's previous avatar in the 90s and the current one. But I can understand where they're coming from in terms of, I'm sure in social policy, they would feel that the Taliban is the same, and I don't doubt that. But Afghanistan and the world both have changed a lot since they were last in power, with the internet, with an entire generation that's grown up under a different regime. And that must necessitate some difference in the way the regime governs. So in your view, what are the differences you see between the Taliban 1.0, as we say, and the Taliban 2.0 in the way they function and administer the country?
Well, I think if you watched what happened post-August 15, 2021, the developments indicated that Taliban were projecting a very moderate image at one level because they were wanting to gain international legitimacy and, more importantly, funding from the international community. So there was a kind of initial phase where they did show us kind of moderation and being amenable to change. But gradually over time, when they didn't get any support from the international community the way they wanted, especially in terms of recognition, they hardened their position. And from my senses, like if you make a comparison between Taliban 1.2 and the present regime, that is Taliban 2.0, there is a difference in the sense in the previous regime, that is during 1.0, they were a monolithic organization, very strongly controlled by the emir and had very rigid worldview. But the present Taliban, in the last 2 decades of the insurgency itself, are quite different in certain ways. So you do hear reports about the moderates and the hardliners and the differences between them playing out. And the hope the international community, particularly countries in the West, had was that they could reach out to the moderate and bring about changing their behavior, particularly in making certain concessions on women's rights, education, and health sector. And that seemed to work to a certain level. Like you do have the two Taliban from two shuras, that's Kabul and Kandahar shuras. But the Kandahar shura is quite rigid because the emir has a certain point of view which is very rigid and cannot be changed at various levels. So there was this attempt to bring about the moderate faction, engage them at certain levels, and that is still being tried out by various countries. But if you take a kind of a whole view of what it means in terms of change in policy or change in mindset, or even a comparison between Taliban 1.0 and Taliban 2.0, is that it comes down to the same thing because the leadership is so rigid, has a regressive world, not be amenable to any change. And every time there are attempts to bring about change, the MA comes out with a message saying that you need to unify. So if you see, there were differences evolving between the defense minister, that's Mullah Yaqub, and Sirajuddin Haqqani. But once the message came from the emir that you got to be united, you have to fall in line, otherwise he's going to step down. So those things change, and what you see is that they look like the exact replica of Taliban 1.0 now. So you see there is a difference in certain levels, as you said, because they have been exposed to social media, they have been exposed to TVs and other such stuff. But when it comes to the leadership, there is control. So it's very difficult to break that. Now, from my personal experience, I had interviewed a couple of Taliban commanders at the provincial levels when I was working in Afghanistan. And they seemed amenable to change in the sense they were okay with women working, they were okay with the girls going to school. I also interviewed some at the High Peace Council in Kabul in 2012 onwards. I'd been working on a project related to understanding the mindset within the Taliban. And they seemed amenable to change. But the function of the international community in engaging those and bringing about that changes by giving aid or assistance based on changes as demonstrated by the behavior on the ground, that really hasn't happened. So what we see is, as most of the human rights groups and other Afghans would talk about, particularly the women groups, is that there is no change because there has not been a kind of a systematic, coordinated effort in bringing about change. If the country A gives money or aid to Afghanistan or to the Taliban because they want certain interest to protect it, then the other country loses. So it's always a zero-sum game in that sense. So the difference between the regime now looks the same because of the situation after 3 years. But initially, there were windows of opportunity to bring about the change in behavior. I think the UN could have played a more important role in strategy of having a roadmap of how to engage the different factions and bring about some kind of change and accountability for the money UN and the international community is giving to Afghanistan and on humanitarian ground.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I also heard some news about when they were closing girls' schools, that there was some resistance from the governors of the Western provinces, which are less Pashtun dominated. You know, they were more amenable to keeping the schools open. But I guess the discipline of the Taliban ultimately enforced the policy. Is that true, or?
Yeah, there were differences in between various provinces. Even in the south, some of the provinces, and even within the Haqqani network, there were differences. So it play out at various levels. But the whole factor that the emir has so much of control. And he has a small coterie of advisors, and he only listens to them. So beyond that, I mean, it's very difficult to break in and get a kind of understanding of what will bring about change. So talk to people who are at Doha, they seem amenable to change. They want to bring about that change. They want girls to go to school. They want women to work and have the right to employment. But that doesn't translate because you have an emir with that whole. So it's actually a very difficult situation. So even if there are differences inside Afghanistan and even the Pashtuns who are amenable, it's not that all Pashtuns are opposed to girls' education. They are not. And and if you talk to people, women in Afghanistan, which is again very important because you have a different image. Like at some level, women can work. They can do their own business. They can do their trade and craft. But they can't go to school, can't learn new skills. So at the end of it, you'll be left with an entire generation of women being deprived of that capacity, and then that will lead to a kind of a deficit in the society. And that will be very hard to fill.
So, speaking about the different factions of the Taliban, the one thing we hear a lot abroad is that this Taliban is the Pashtun phenomenon. It's a Pashtun-dominated movement, and the rest of Afghanistan is just suffering under them. And on the other hand, you hear that the Taliban consists of many, many different factions. It's not so much a unified movement as many different factions. Afghanistan isn't a democracy, but the Taliban still has to deal with the politics of the different factions within the Taliban, as well as the broader groups and ethnicities in Afghanistan. So maybe could you give us an overview of the politics of Afghanistan, and what are the different factions and groups both within and outside the ruling coalition, and how does the government manage those relations? Is it a bargain and negotiation thing? Is it a coercive relationship? How does that system work?
Yeah, there are a lot of factions. If you look at the reports which came initially for the development, once they captured power, because I think when they captured power, they themselves weren't prepared that Kabul will fall so easily, and they'll have to occupy various positions of power and run a government machinery. And there was the citadel power struggles developing, particularly between the Haqqani group and the Yaqubs and the Baradars and all of that. But then how the Taliban manages this is a very simple fact that the Emir controls everything and everyone falls in place. Now, interestingly, and what has worked to the advantage of Taliban is they have an external body called the Islamic State. So any talk of modifying their behavior or moderating their behavior comes with the caveat that will dilute the Taliban within itself. So they have actually had holding on to the strict view because they don't want their cadres to leave the Taliban and go and join the ISK. And that has been a concern because as the insurgent group captured power and came to become rulers, there was a certain kind of moderation, and those who felt that the real tenets of the insurgent group or the group itself has been watered down started switching sides and going to the ISK. Likewise, some of them went for pecuniary gains. So they started losing. So they, because of that, they started controlling more. And then the Emir had taken a very strong stand of unifying them. And since they have an external body like the ISK, they managed to hold themselves together because they see that as a threat. So that they have done inside the group. But there are differences at various levels, but that doesn't really translate into something by which you can, topple the group or decimate the group or replace the group. That I think is be a little bit far-fetched scenario for now because of the control and the discipline the group has exhibited so far. And if you look at the factions outside who are actually working, like for instance, a lot of opposition groups also work functioning in Afghanistan at the moment, their activity seems to be increasing. And they seem to be making some dent inside the Taliban as well in terms of their contacts. So there are a lot of reports even of the Islamic State making inroads into the Taliban and having that kind of nexus being developed with Taliban. So it'd be very interesting and important to see how Taliban controls. But as I said before, as long as the Emir has the control and has the authority, which he has on a religious and ideological ground, I think the group will remain unified, and they will be managing the differences which are playing out by giving them little benefits here and there in terms of the ministries or in terms of the income and other such pecuniary benefits. But more important is the fact that they are united because of the ideological stand, and the Emir still has control. So that's how I see them managing their differences for now. It will be, in the long term, it might take some time when things get difficult for Afghanistan, when there's no money coming in and people start resisting. Because if you look at the recent which are coming out, it's interesting to see that many people don't think that Taliban have been able to govern the country well. But it's almost 96% in a survey which was conducted recently, which showed that the Afghans themselves do not have faith in the Taliban being able to do much better.
I commend the survey agency that actually managed to conduct a good survey in Afghanistan. That's quite impressive.
Yeah, I can send you the thing of the report, but it is the UNAMA report, and you can have a look at it. And they say that only 4% of Afghans want the Taliban government to be recognized because they don't think the governance has been great. And this interview was conducted in 33 provinces, and it's quite detailed in not many ways. So this shows that only 4% want recognition for the Taliban at all.
Right. I have a question about the other ethnic groups like the Shias, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and I think this slides into the next question because you mentioned, ISIS-K, and one of the major concerns for the international community is the return of terrorism in Afghanistan, like we saw in the 90s, particularly groups like IS-K. What is your sense of the danger of terror groups proliferating in Afghanistan, and how is the Taliban regime responding?
Well, the terrorist landscape in Afghanistan seems problematic and worrisome for two reasons. I mean, the first question you asked us is of IS, and everyone's concerned about IS because that's the bogey the Taliban have used, and everyone thinks that by cooperating with Taliban, you have a reliable counter-terrorist partner to fight the IS. Now, look at that's the reason, one of the reasons the Americans had signed the agreement with the Taliban is to fight the IS, but also you look at what's happening in terms of Al-Qaeda, which seems to have been forgotten. Now, if you look at the Al-Qaeda presence, and again, the UN report, the UNSC monitoring team report of 1267, clearly points out that Al-Qaeda presence has increased in Afghanistan. They have safe havens, they have training camps, they are present in more than 12 provinces, and they are able to continue the activities from there. Interestingly, the strategic silence of Al-Qaeda has been misunderstood and has been less studied by countries and the experts because Al-Qaeda is remaining silent now, but doesn't mean it's not going to continue its activity. It's inviting its fighters from worldwide to come to Afghanistan because once again they've defeated the foreigners and they have a base. It's a safe haven for them. So there are bases, there are training camps, and they are spreading in Afghanistan. So just wanted to bring out the Al-Qaeda element, which again is very important. Now, IS, and your question on IS. Now, this is again important because IS has increased its presence. So if you look at the numbers, it has increased from 4,000 to 6,000 fighters. And this is because IS affiliates in the region, that is Islamic State, Pakistan province, and Islamic State Hind province, and others associated with the ISK, have increased their number and they are spreading. And that's because I told you, like many of these people who are disenchanted with the Taliban have joined. So you have the Pakistani TTP joining them, and they also are interestingly getting the recruits from Tajik and Uzbek communities. And so you do see a kind of change in the dynamics of, other groups joining the IS, opposing the Taliban, and there's a stockpiling of arms and explosives in remote areas in the west of Afghanistan. So despite the loss of the territory and attrition among senior and mid-tier leadership figures of the ISK, it remains a threat beyond, in the region and beyond. The Taliban have made, consistent statements and claims that they have defeated IS. That's not really true. So, as I mentioned, if you look at the figures which have increased in terms of numbers, that is from 4,000 to 6,000, and the core strength remains very active, and it's still in Afghanistan. That's at 2,000 to 3,500. So these are figures, and they also seem to have, as I mentioned before, infiltrated the main ministries of Ministry of Interior, Defense, and General Directorate of Intelligence of the Taliban as well. So this is emerging as a very worrisome situation, both on counts of the Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda. But associated with them are also other groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the ETIM, the anti-India groups. All of them seem to have got a base in Afghanistan again. And the fact that the world has forgotten Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda, which carried out its attack from Afghanistan in 1990s and then 2001, is again has found base, not just finding, and is training and having connections with the Taliban. Some of the reports also show how much of the governance structure is shared with Al-Qaeda. So I think this is a very worrisome threat which cannot be ignored and which needs greater attention in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan, first economically, then politically, and then also looking at the security. Because the economic black hole itself is leading to a kind of a situation where many in Afghanistan are joining these groups.
Right, and just to clarify, these all three, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, IS, and the Taliban, they draw primarily from the Sunni groups. I don't know if the Shia groups allowed by them, are they?
Yeah, no, they're basically Sunni groups, but the factor is that it depends on whom they are targeting, right? So if you look at ISK, basically they look at, they, as you mentioned, they have indications about their attacks on Russia. And Russia is very much concerned. Likewise, Iran is very much concerned. Pakistan is also getting concerned because of the affiliates which are getting, which are mushrooming in that region. So it is the Sunni group, but the fact is that it targets certain. So if you look at the Shia population per se, they do get targeted at various levels. But it's important to understand that the group itself has a huge support base inside Afghanistan, and most of them are being run from the Taliban and from the TTP, that is the Tehrik-e-Taliban Party.
Right. And now, since you mentioned Pakistan, I guess we can move on to maybe the broader regional dynamics of the Taliban regime and its interactions with its neighbors. So what's interesting is that the Taliban was broadly supported by elements in Pakistan before its takeover of Afghanistan. But now, as we can see, there does seem to be some friction between the two. In addition, the Taliban regime has a difficult relation with Iran, to say the least, but seems to be at least trying to reach out for better relations with India. Could you expand on the complexities in these regional dynamics and in the Taliban's relations with its neighbors, and in particular with its former, let's say, patrons in Pakistan? How are those relationships evolving at this point?
Well, as you know, Pakistan has played a very important role in the evolution of Taliban in the 1980s and 1990s during the Soviet independence. So in Pakistan's madrasas, that the Taliban were trained, recruited, and nurtured, and then seen as a strategic tool. One is to counter India in terms of the strategic depth, and secondly is in terms of having security in Afghanistan for access to trade routes and Central Asian Republic. And that was seen in 1990s, where there was this direct connection. And after 9/11 attacks, when the US initiated Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001, most of this Taliban leadership escaped from Afghanistan. They were not really killed, into Pakistan, where they were provided safe havens. So they were in cities in Pakistan, particularly Quetta, Shura, where the political leadership of the Taliban was based. So they did get support, they did get the incentives and the protection needed to carry out their insurgency inside Afghanistan from Pakistan from 2001 2021. Now, what happened after 2021 is a fact of a classic blowback. So Pakistan, which had invested tremendously in Taliban, expected it to be a kind of a strategic asset, but it turned out to be the other way around. Because once the Taliban captured power, they wanted to assert independence in terms of having their say on various issues, particularly on the border. As you know, the Duran line has been contested, and Pakistan is quite keen on fencing the border, which every group in Afghanistan opposes, and the Taliban opposes that as well. And so more importantly, it's the fact that Taliban have provided sanctuary to the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP group. And the TTP group is carrying out attacks inside Pakistan from Afghanistan. So this is a complete turnaround of the situation, but this is seen as a kind of a strategic blowback for Pakistan. And at the moment, things are very difficult between the two countries, because as much as Pakistan requests assistance from the Taliban in Afghanistan to deal with this group, they don't, because as you know, Afghanistan is a very traditional society, and Pashtuns have their own code of Pashtun Wali, where they do give protection to their guests. And TTP is their guest, so they will not renege on that. And that symbiotic nexus exists. And likewise, as I mentioned before, the symbiotic nexus exists with Al-Qaeda, and so with TTP. So it's a very difficult situation for Pakistan today, because it's not got what it had invested in the group, and in consequence of what's happening on the TTP, and the difficulty in relationship plays out in many ways. And Pakistan has used periodically the tool of pushing back refugees from the country into Afghanistan as a pressure tactic on the Taliban to bring about change in behavior or negotiate with the Taliban on account of the TTP. But that itself has been a little difficult, because it's not worked either ways. So if you look at the scenario of how Pakistan is dealing with this thing, it's in a situation which is not really a win-win situation. Now, on the contrary, India, which had invested immensely in the Afghan government of the time, because it did want a stable Afghanistan, which was seen as in its interest, its national interest, to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, and the conflict being contained within Afghanistan itself and not spilling over, supported the Afghan government and did not engage the Taliban. Now, post-2021, Taliban has captured the de facto authority, and they have made outreach numerous times to India, maybe as a kind of a strategic game between India and Pakistan, because they also seem to be learning the ropes of diplomacy in their own way. So they didn't make an outreach to India, and India has provided assistance in terms of providing wheat and humanitarian assistance, medical supplies. In times of crisis, India has provided help to certain provinces which were being hit by earthquakes. So India used this gap from 2021 to gradually build engagement with the Taliban. And this is a scenario for, which is evolving at a time when India had to really pack its bag and leave Afghanistan on August 15, 2021. And by June 2022, they had reopened the mission and they're carrying on the humanitarian work, and levels of engagement with the Taliban seems to have increased at various levels. So this is a very interesting scenario, looking at how this regional power play is playing out. Now, if you look at other countries like Iran, likewise, initially it did support the United States during the Operation Enduring Freedom, and then the Bush administration putting them in the axis of evil and made them change their position, and then they started supporting the Taliban. Once the Taliban captured power, things started becoming difficult. Issues on issues on border, particularly with the water issue, the Helmand water issue became a contentious point, and also the refugees also became another issue. So Iran also started pushing back refugees as Taliban started making things difficult for them. Likewise with Russia, and Central Asian republics. And now Central Asian republics, some of these countries are hosting the opposition groups. But gradually, over time, there seems to be a certain level of engagement with the Taliban, which is operating on the regional power scene. And that seems to be playing in a way that, countries are not really into recognize the Taliban, but engaging the Taliban, because the reality is that they are there and they will be there for some time. So you have to deal with them. So different countries have adopted different strategies, but yes, a certain level of engagement exists at this moment.
Does India's continued support and funding for the Chabahar port in Iran, is that done with an eye on Afghanistan still?
Yes, it is. And this was because initially was one of the reasons was a difficult relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if you know, the Afghanistan-Pakistan Trade and Transit Agreement provides for Afghans to carry trade and transit with India. But what has happened is the goods can come from Afghanistan to India, but goods cannot be taken from India back to Afghanistan. So it would become very restrictive. So from then on, India had been looking at alternate options, and it had looked at Chabahar. So it was more than 2 decades of looking for options and working around Chabahar as an alternate route. That just a couple of months back they signed the deal, and agreement has been signed, and it's with the eye on Afghanistan. And it's also a pressure point on Pakistan, which doesn't allow trade and transit to occur. For India, Afghanistan is just not a security situation as per se, just more also an economic opportunity. India looks at Afghanistan as a land bridge connecting Central Asia with India for trade transit and also for energy pipelines. So India has used various options, but given the fact that the difficult relationship between Afghanistan and then Pakistan and India plays out a different level, India has made this alternate route a kind of a policy option of accessing Afghanistan through the Chabahar and giving Afghans an alternative which they very much need.
Right, which is interesting because, they're pushing it, in the face of considerable U.S. displeasure, which means that they do probably have intentions of dealing with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. It's still part of the broader strategy. But, as coming to the end of this interview, we're witnessing perhaps a broader change in the global paradigm. right? We're seeing perhaps the rise of China. We're seeing a different security dynamic with relations to Russia. I'm wondering how these global dynamics, this change, is playing out in terms of Afghanistan and its foreign policy. So maybe as we bring this interview to a close, could you talk about Afghanistan's role in the world now and what its foreign policy and its foreign relations are in the context of, one could call it, a new great game?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about this because, at one level, everyone seems to have forgotten Afghanistan, which is actually a kind of a mistake because it's a very important country sitting at a strategic crossroads. And who seems to be the beneficiary at this point of time is China. And I wanted to talk a bit about China because China has expanded its engagement with the Taliban immensely. They have sent a new ambassador. They have recognized the Taliban appointee there. And they are in talks with the Taliban, with the Belt and Road Initiative. They are investing in the mining sector and they're reaching out to the Taliban on various levels of doing trade and other such mining and business opportunities. So what the US seems to have lost in terms of strategic engagement with the Taliban in Afghanistan, China and Russia seems to have take advantage of it. And the other countries also who have stepped in not many ways. Turkey is doing a lot more. Then you have UAE, Qatar and all of these countries. Japan is also open its mission. So you do see there is a certain level of functioning engagement with the Taliban minus the recognition. But if you look at what's happening in terms of the global order at the moment and most of the focus being on China and the Indo-Pacific, I think conflicts which have potential to bring about a lot of geopolitical churning, especially in Afghanistan, where a lot of countries are getting involved again. In addition to the fact that there is a security black hole and there is a security threat emerging from that country. And then you have people who are leaving, the refugee issues and the drugs flowing out of the country. So it seems like, it is sadly mistaken, but it needs to be brought to the forefront because it's just not a question of humanitarian issues, but it's also about stabilizing that country. Without that, I think there'll be more instability in the region, it will spill over, and it will have implications for all the countries in the region, including China and Russia and United States and the West.
Yeah, I guess that's a challenge to balance our critique of the humanitarian violations that are happening in Afghanistan with the need to engage them at some level because, if the West and if India don't engage it, then the only other options are Russia and China who don't particularly care about women's rights in the country.
It's about, the West and the rest kind of a phenomena at the moment because, you take a principled position with a group who doesn't actually acknowledge or understand the principle. It will take a lot of time and strategic patience to work with them, to make them understand that, you need to have certain norms of functioning in terms of international law. You need to have certain norms of functioning in terms of inclusion because they are not there by getting themselves elected or they don't represent the will of the Afghan people. But still, you have to engage them over time that they bring about a change in their behavior when they see how the other countries are functioning, because they're very much interested in, particularly in countries like India, of looking at governance models, or with the US in terms of the trade and business models. So they are looking for opportunities. So I think it makes sense to have small levels of engagements on areas which matter to Afghan people, say for instance, education, health, or in terms of business and trade opportunities or employment and alternate livelihoods. So when you start working with them and they come out from Afghanistan and they are seeing the rest of the world, I think that will bring about a change in their worldview gradually. Now, how that will impact the leadership is the function of the fact that when you have most of your fighters and followers not really adhering to what you're saying and gradually you lose the hold, I think that will come about when, you have a certain level of engagement and those people have certain level of exposure and certain level of incentive to engage with the world. Because at this point of time, what looks difficult in Afghanistan is bringing about the change. But that's not really impossible. There is a fatigue inside Afghanistan. People want change. People inside Afghanistan want change. They want better lives.
Right. So definitely something that we should be following and not ignoring for the next few years. But Dr. D'Souza, thanks so much. That was fascinating, and that was an insight into the country that I don't think we hear often. So thanks so much for your input and thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much.